Hello, and welcome to the Romancing in Paris podcast. I'm your host, Heise. In this podcast, we'll be traveling around the city as I pick out my top romantic spots per arrondissement. You don't have to visit these places only as a couple. Exploring them can be the expression of your own love of Paris. Are you ready to get romancing in Paris? In this episode of Romancing in Paris, we venture across the Seine River, over to the left bank of Paris, and to the 5th arrondissement, extending west from Le Jardin des Plantes over to the Boulevard Saint-Michel, and south from the City Islands to Boulevard de Port-Royal. The 5th is technically the oldest part of Paris, since the Roman city of Lutetia occupied a great portion of this area. The district can sometimes get something of a bad rap from locals due to the touristy part of the Latin Quarter. Nevertheless, there's much more to the 5th than those few streets packed with mediocre restaurants and souvenir shops. The ancient streets deeper into the district can be perfect for a romantic stroll, especially in the evening. The Rue Mouffetard and Place de la Contrescarpe are lovely and local, plus there are some great hidden sites in the district. However, we aren't going to dive that far into the 5th today. Instead, we're going to drift along its northern border, which consists of my absolute favorite stretch of the Seine on the left bank. Grab your chérie. We're going to the Quai de la Tournelle. When one thinks of Paris, images of the Seine River are among the first to spring to mind. In fact, the city is intrinsically linked to its main waterway. Many of its most important sites are built along its banks, from the Louvre to the Eiffel Tower. The cultural riches along the Seine are so important that in 1991 they were classified as a whole as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the only one on that list in Paris. As you might be aware, the riverbanks in Paris are called quais, spelt Q-U-A-I. In English, we would use the term wharf, dock, or bank. I've also heard the same word employed, but spelt with a Y and pronounced quay. I suppose it's a case of tomato, or rather tomato-tomate. I will be pronouncing it in the French way during this episode. There are over 40 quays in Paris, more than there are bridges. They change names every few streets or so, usually in relation to the place they run alongside, like the Quai de l'Hôtel de Ville, which is next to City Hall, the Quai aux Fleurs, which flanks the flower market on Ile de la Cité, and the Quai d'Orsay, which extends from the world-famous museum until the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at Invalides, found in a historic private mansion that is locally referred to simply as the Quai d'Orsay. Sometimes the section along the river's edge and the road above it have different names, and the lower section is often referred to as a port. This is the case with the Quai de la Tournelle, whose waterside section is called the Port de la Tournelle. For our romantic purposes, I shall be considering both the quay and the port as one. The specific location of the Quai de la Tournelle is what gives it its superior allure. It runs from the beginning of Boulevard Saint-Germain at the Institut du Monde Arabe, all the way to the small Rue Maître Albert. which juts south just after the Pont de l'Archevêque, the bridge at the back of Notre Dame. I've gone and given you a big clue as to why this particular quay is so special. In my opinion, this quay boasts the very best views of Notre Dame, although her current state, still under renovations, has somewhat detracted from the view. I'm going to expand on all of this in more detail over the course of the podcast. But the quay's vista of La Grande Dame de Paris isn't its sole selling factor. Before we get around to the history of this particular quay, let's explore that of the riverbanks of Paris as a whole. In centuries past, the riverbanks weren't built up with stone as they are today. This urban project only began in the 18th century. Instead, certain sections were actual working ports, mainly for merchandise. There was a busy one next to Hôtel de Ville, and then others, such as the one by the old wine warehouses of the city, now refurbished as the Cours Saint-Emilion, Bercy village in eastern Paris. As the banks were gradually built up, the popularity of the Seine as a place for strolling also rose. This increased substantially with the various world fairs held in Paris, whose buildings and fairgrounds were established at different sites along the river, such as the Grand and Petit Palais, the Palais de Tokyo, the Palais de Chaillot at Trocadero, and, of course, the Eiffel Tower. In the 1960s, expressways were constructed along certain stretches of both the left and right banks. The 1980s saw a different development along the river, with the creation of walkways and parks on certain stretches of the lower, former ports, like the Tino Rosso Park, home to a sculpture garden and outdoor dance areas, also located in the Fifth. In the early 2000s, parts of these expressways were closed on Sundays to allow for strolling right along the Seine. These were more recently transformed into full-time year-round promenades. That of the left bank Les Berges, running from the Musée d'Orsay to the Eiffel Tower, and the right bank Parc Rive de Seine, extending from south of Bastille to the Louvre. So, where does our romantic Quai de la Tournelle fit into this global riverside picture? To discover this, we need to go back almost 1,000 years in history. We'll be right back with Romancing in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Romancing in Paris. Quai de la Tournelle. Tournelle. The name provides a hint towards its origins. In French, une tour is a tower, so une tournelle is a small tower. You might recall that as we discussed in previous episodes of both Romancing in Paris and my other podcast, Paris Cachée, the city used to be much smaller back in medieval times. Indeed, in the last episode of Romancing in Paris, we saw how the Rue des Barres, which is located on the opposite side of the river as the Quai de la Tournelle, used to be the border of Paris. When the city wall was expanded and further developed at the turn of the 13th century by King Philippe Auguste, the eastern edge of the left bank section of the wall ended at the river, virtually where the Quai de la Tournelle begins. At that spot, a large tower was built to protect the wall just like there was on the other three corners of the wall where it met the Seine. As we learnt in previous episodes of my podcasts, in the mid-14th century, King Charles V expanded the city wall on the right bank, but not on the left bank. Instead, various amendments were made to the pre-existing wall, and right here, a small castle fortress replaced the previous tower found on the Quai de la Tournelle. Since the castle was made up of 4 towers, it was called the Château de la Tournelle. In the mid-16th century, the aged fortress was refurbished and converted into a sort of transit jail for galériens, prisoners who were sentenced to forced labor, often in ports, like the character of Jean Valjean in Les Miserables. Over the centuries, a port of the same name, used to unload goods from boats moored along the river here, was established. There are then records dating back to 1636 in which the name of the street was officially Rue du Quai de la Tournelle. A gateway into the city was also added next to the chateau fortress. However, the building's fate, like certain others linked to the tyranny of the Ancien Regime, such as the Bastille, shifted dramatically during the Revolution, and the castle was torn down in the 1790s. Unfortunately, nothing of it remains. Well, nothing physical, but in name, yes. As we'll see more examples of shortly as we venture along the quay ourselves. If you come here for a stroll, which I hope you are encouraged to do after listening to this podcast, I suggest starting at the beginning of the quay, on its eastern edge, then to walk west, towards Notre Dame. There are several places of note along the way. But before you embark down the quay, I might also recommend you cheat a little by starting with popping into the Institut du Monde Arabe. I say cheat because its address isn't officially on the quay. However, the building presides over it. This institution, dedicated to promoting the culture of the Arab world, is free to go inside. Take the elevator up to the top floor and go out onto the terrace. Here you can admire a gorgeous view of the city, in particular of the Quai de la Tournelle, but also the Ile Saint-Louis, the Ile de la Cité, and Notre Dame. The building also has a museum and cafe worth visiting, but perhaps you can save these for another day. Back on the quay, and I suggest you walk along the waterside instead of the building side. Carry on until you reach the next bridge. From here, look across the street and raise your head up high to the top of the building, where you can see the quay's first venue of note. High above numbers 15 to 17 of Quai de la Tournelle is one of the most famous restaurants in Paris, if not the whole world, La Tour d'Argent. In addition to its global fame, it is also considered one of the oldest restaurants in the city. Originally called l'Hostellerie de la Tour d'Argent, the restaurant was founded in 1582 by a renowned chef of the time called Routot. The Hostellerie just so happened to be located near the aforementioned Château de la Tournelle, one of whose 4 towers was nicknamed the Tour d'Argent, or the Silver Tower, due to its shimmering surface, covered not in silver but in mica. A 3 Michelin-starred restaurant, La Tour d'Argent is certainly an ideal spot for a special romantic meal. That said, eating here costs more than the price of gold, let alone silver. Not everyone has the budget for dining at this starred restaurant. However, across the street, they've actually opened up a rotisserie, which has more reasonable prices, as well as some romantic seating right across the street, overlooking the river. Next to the rotisserie is the Tour d'Argent's bakery, Le Boulangerie de la Tour, where you could also pick up a treat to accompany your stroll. Although its namesake, the Château de la Tournelle, was torn down, the quay does have a few other historic places of interest. Before moving onwards, look above the bridge. On its southeastern corner is a statue of Saint Genevieve, one of the patron saints of Paris, and one who is intrinsically linked to the 5th District. Back in the mid-5th century, Genevieve was famed for having saved the city from an imminent attack of Attila and the Huns. The story is a little more complicated than that, but Genevieve became a very important symbol of the strength of the city and its citizens. Added when this bridge was reconstructed in the 1920s, the statue was designed by French sculptor Paul Landowski, the same artist of Rio de Janeiro's famous colossal statue of Christ the Redeemer. Here, Genevieve faces east, the direction the Huns would have been coming from. Next up is the Hôtel de Miramion, located at number 47. This is a former Hôtel Particulier, a 17th century private mansion. Other private mansions were also built along the road, as the area was then becoming popular with financiers who had the budget to build these elaborate homes. The Hôtel de Miramion was later owned by a certain pious aristocrat, Madame de Miramion, who gave the building its name and converted it into a home to educate poor young women, in the spirit of Saint Genevieve, one could say. A little further down the street, at number 55 to 57, is another private mansion of the era, the Hôtel de Nesmond. The plot of land itself is recorded as far back as 1260, when it was the residence of the bread maker of King Philippe le Bel. Several centuries later, in 1643, François Théodore de Nesmond, the president of the Parliament of Paris, bought that medieval residence and transformed it into a large Renaissance-style building, which is the one standing at the address today. Their name still features on the sign above the building's gateway. I did some digging around to try to see if I could find some romantic intrigue in these buildings or their families. Alas, nothing too exciting to report. Nevertheless, you can still imagine what it would be like to call one of these vast mansions home. When you reach the Pont de l'Archevêque, cross over to the other side, as at its western corner you can enjoy a sublime view of Notre Dame and the picturesque port down below. It might be one of the most beautiful vantage points in all of Paris. Breathtaking day or night, it's the perfect place to steal a kiss. From here, you can continue walking along the quay and peruse the row of Paris's famous bouquinistes, the classic bookseller kiosks found along the river. You can help support this dying tradition by picking out a book or vintage poster for your sweetheart. It's also an original way to immortalize your special stroll along this terribly romantic quay. When you reach the next bridge, the Pont au Double, I suggest taking the steps down to the riverside. Here you can backtrack east along the quay, taking in more of its charm from the perspective of the river's edge. But Don't get too caught up in gazing at the cathedral's flying buttresses. With plenty of walking or missing cobblestones, the walkway is a bit hazardous. There are a few barges moored here, including La Nouvelle Seine, a hybrid restaurant theatre. This is another reason why I chose the Quai for this episode, as you could also end your outing here over a reasonably priced dinner, much cheaper than the Tour d'Argent, and with an unobstructed view of Notre Dame. Check out their agenda as they host fun cabaret nights and other entertaining shows. You can also keep walking along the port side of the quay, taking in the views and romantic tranquility. Just past the Pont de l'Archevêque is a large flat section next to the river, one of my favorite picnic spots in all of Paris. So if you plan ahead and bring some supplies, you could also end your outing with some nibbles, wine, or other delectables at this enchanting location, sunsetting in the distance or to the rising twilight. If you carry on walking, you can extend your stroll along the aforementioned Parc Tino Rossi, or why not take in some tango or salsa dancing in the evenings? This is all just so ideal for romancing in Paris. Thank you for listening to this edition of the Romancing in Paris podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. That way you won't miss the next one. Ratings or reviews are also another way to share the amour. If you would like to discover other romantic places in the 5th District, see my website, jetammeneither.com, for my ultimate guides to the top romantic spots per district of Paris. The Quai de la Tournelle also stars in one of the chapters of my latest book, There's Only One Paris, and it's a story of romance. This podcast was produced by Paris Underground Radio. Check out their website if you're interested in listening to more great podcasts on Paris, including my other podcast, Paris Cachet, which explores even more lesser-known and hidden places in the city. Until next time, happy romancing in Paris.